from there. So, before we begin, we do not have class next Friday because of Thanksgiving break. So I will not see you for 2 weeks. Just know that. Not going to affect today at all. It's on the syllabus. Just a reminder, you don't have to show up on Zoom. I won't see you next week. I'll see you the week after. So you're just missing the 1 week. But because of we're on this Friday, then there's a blank, and then there's this Friday. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. Yeah. All right. So today's topic is up on the board. Democracy. What is it? What is a democracy? And I mean this in the most flat-footed, not trying to trick you way. What is a democracy? So capitalism is related to it, but it's not necessarily capitalistic. Capitalism is a type of economic system. So a capitalist system is one in which it's the economics being decided. So a democracy is tied in with where people vote for change, but even they are also voting not for change. So what is it about people voting, or what? Well, first off, what type of thing is a democracy? Can a rock be a democracy? And by a rock, I don't mean like the country. I mean like a physical rock. And I also don't mean Dwayne Johnson. I mean like a thing you'd find in the backyard. No, a rock cannot be a democracy. So what sorts of things can be democracies? Nations and groups of people. So yeah, it's a nation is the type of thing, or a group of people can be a democracy. And when we say that nation is a democracy, or that group of people is a democracy, what does that mean? What are we talking about? So it's got to do with voting. So it's about the right to elect. And when you have elections, what exactly does that mean? So what are we talking about when we're talking about elections? What is getting elected? Like, we could elect to cancel class, but that wouldn't make this a democracy in the strictest sense. So representatives, yeah, you are electing representatives, and where are they working, or where are these representatives set up? Or what type of institution are they a part of? Yeah, a government. So that's the key. A democracy is a type of government. But it's not just a type of government. With it goes lots of other sorts of aspects in a society. But this is the key. A democracy is a form of government. And what form of government is it? What types of governments are democracies? What is the characteristic? Well, as some of you said, it's about voting. And it's specifically that everybody, or at least a high percentage of the population, gets to vote on either the issues or votes for people who then vote on the issues. So if that's what a democracy is, what are some other forms of government that aren't democracies? Just to put them all out on the table. Not everywhere in the world is a democracy, and certainly not everywhere in history has been democracies. So what other forms of government are there? So a communist society is one. And so what is a communist society? Well, it's one in which it's not just that everyone is voting, but it's rather built in. And so communist, as we said before, is also tied in with economic sorts of things. So a communist government isn't entirely opposite of a democracy. But the idea would be that in a communist system, everybody has the exact same amount of say. And it's not even built in that there are different sorts of voting. It's rather that an entire group of people gathers in small groups and makes decisions. But what other clearer examples of other forms of government are there? A monarchy, yes. An oligarchy and a monarchy. So oligarchy. An oligarchy is a form of government in which a small number of people decide everything. So you can imagine one in which and how these people get appointed is not by voting. So the key difference between America, in which you say that we have a relatively small group of people who are in Washington making the decisions, but how do they get in Washington? Well, we vote for them. By contrast, an oligarchy will have it decided in another way. So it'll be something along the lines of the 10 richest people decide, or the 10 most powerful religious figures decide. Another one is monarchy. So a monarchy is what? What defines a monarchy? How many people are in charge and who decides how they get there? So it's royalty. So the way you get there is by being royalty. And what determines whether you're royalty or not? Blood, exactly, Daniel. So it's about one person ruling, and that one person simply has the right blood or the right genes. So we've got a monarchy, which is one, an oligarchy, which is a few, and a democracy, which is the many. There's also other forms of single government. What are the other forms of single government? It doesn't have to be a right by blood. What are other types of governments in which only one person's in charge? But that person didn't get it because of who their dad was. A totalitarian dictatorship would be the one. So totalitarian is more about the nature of how much power someone has, but a dictator is a government in which dictatorship is a form of government in which one and only one person is in charge. And how within a dictatorship is the dictator decided? Usually. What allows someone to become a dictator? Yeah, it's a coup or a power. It's basically just a military takeover that ends up putting one person in charge. So these are our various forms of government we can talk about. Democracies, the many, oligarchies and other sorts of things, which are the few, and monarchies and dictatorships that are the one. So generally speaking, you personally, what is your favorite form of government? Or a way of putting this is, which of these forms of government would you most want to live under? Personally, and there's no right answer to this. You might love queens. Or you might think that deciding by blood is not actually that bad of a way of doing it. What is the one that you would most want to live under? There's, again, not a right answer. Just be ready to justify it. So we've got a few votes for democracy. Whatever they have in Norway. So Norway is a form of democracy, but it is a very so their governmental system and their economic systems are very so basically what Norway does is they're similar in terms of it being elected, but the government also basically taxes are supremely high. Only those taxes are distributed to everyone. So it's more an economic difference between Norway or Sweden or any of those Scandinavian countries and the United States. But in terms of what form of voting is it, what form of government, it's also democracy. So those of you who said democracy, why? What is it about a democracy that we like? So let's just talk about democracy here. What is good about a democracy? Why is it why people always, so when for instance, when the United States invaded Iraq and said we are going to put up a democratic institution, people, generally speaking, were okay with the idea of putting a democracy in another nation. They weren't like that is a terrible idea. Instead, it was more like a democracy is a valid or good thing to do. So putting it in new places is a good thing. So what is it that people like? Well, part of it is freedom. But freedom is a very general term. So what do we mean by freedom here? You have a right to say whether you agree or not. So you have a freedom of speech, which is something we touched on a couple classes ago in terms of hate speech. The opportunity to choose, but choose what? So for instance, if you're in a totalitarian dictatorship, you still have the choice of what to eat for breakfast in many cases, as long as you have access to it. Like, just because Hitler's in charge, the people in Germany were still allowed to choose whether they had eggs or pancakes for breakfast. So what are we choosing here? What is this opportunity we're getting? You have a choice as to who's going to be in office. And why does that matter? Choose elected officials. We can choose who's going to be in office is a big one. We vote for someone who will benefit us. So yeah, this is one of the things we like about democracy. In a monarchy, who decides what the government is going to do? A monarch, just the king or queen. So if the king decides they want to kill everybody, what can you do about it? You can either do nothing or start a war. Those are your only two options. In the United States, if the president is doing something you don't like, what can you do about it? Well, nothing technically at that moment in time, but what can you do long term? Or, and even with nothing technically, like you can't jump inside the king's head, or I mean the president's head, yet you can protest, you can impeach. If you don't like what the king is doing in an absolute monarchy, you can't even protest, because what happens if you protest against the king? Yeah, death. You will get your head chopped off, or you will get tortured for treason. By contrast, in the United States, if you don't like what the president's doing, at the very least, you can protest and you can try to change other people's opinions. And the next time there's an election, if you're a citizen, you can vote for somebody else. So this is, you get to choose your elected officials. And why does that matter? Well, you can choose people who align with your values. You can choose people who are able to, you are able to be heard and be represented in a way that isn't necessarily the case for a monarchy or for a dictatorship or even for an oligarchy. What are some other benefits of democracy? So it's not just that you personally are getting to choose and benefits. If everybody's getting voted, or everyone has the right to vote, what does that mean about every citizen in the nation? If everyone has the same vote and the same amount of control, at least in theory, there's a sense of fairness. Yeah, democracy is very much tied in with a sense of fairness and equality for all. So if you believe that every human being is equal and should have a right to in equal control over their life, and not that there are certain people who are just the genetic betters of other people, or people who just should be in charge given that they took it for themselves and everyone else should just fall in line. If you believe that people are fundamentally equal and everyone should fundamentally have an equal control over their life, then a democracy is the form of government that is most in line with that view. If everybody is equal, and that is shown in the fact that everybody gets a vote. What are other things we like about democracy as opposed to other forms of government? So we've got this sense of fairness, these sense of freedoms. What are some other things? Another way of asking this is, if I were to tell you that there's going to be a coup and tomorrow there's going to be a dictator in charge of the United States, what wouldn't you like about that? So yeah, so we'd be getting treated unfairly. So again, the fairness aspect is coming up. And what are some other ways in which that fairness would come out? Not just in terms of voting and in terms of your opportunities. Yeah, so you're being forced to be loyal. So it's also not just a freedom of choosing your elected officials or freedom of speech. There's a lack of being able to choose even what your feelings about something are. So in an ideal democracy, everyone is allowed to go with their heart to a certain degree. You are not by forced to agree with whoever's in power. So another advantage of a democracy is, generally speaking, it is harder for a minority of people to force their views on everybody else. So for instance, many people under a dictatorship don't agree with what the dictator is doing. However, because the dictator has control of the military, they have to go along with it. Otherwise, they could get eliminated. By contrast, in a democracy, you are able to choose what you want to believe. and act upon it. So all of this is the reason why people like, generally speaking, because we in the United States, it's just taken for granted that a democracy is a good thing. You are taught that democracy is a good thing from the time you are a child. But why are you being taught this? What is in the background of this? It's not like freedom is a nice word that rings nicely, but what is it about freedom we like? Well, it's about having control over your own life. It's about doing what you want to do. So all of this makes sense to everybody. Is everyone on board with what a democracy is, why we like it? All right. So I do want to highlight, though, a democracy, like any form of government, is not perfect. And what I want to do here is highlight some of the issues with a democracy so that when we're talking, once we bring technology into it, we can see the ways in which technology and democracy are not entirely in line in every case. So these are all the things that we like about democracy, but what are some of the flaws with a democracy? Because a lot of these are minor things, but they are things that can become very problematic if, what's the best way of putting this? They can get very problematic if certain conditions aren't met. So what are some of the issues with a democracy? And some of these we've touched on throughout the semester already. Can anyone think of what some of the problems with a democracy? So one thing is corruption can happen. So corruption can happen. So one thing about a democracy is it's not perfect. The ways in which, now corruption can strike every sort of government institution. And by corruption here, what we mean is people in power doing things not because of the way it's supposed to work, but because of what sorts of money they're getting paid on the side, or they're being bribed, or they're claiming that they're doing things for the greater good, but really they're doing it for their own benefits. So that's one issue. Another thing is what Daniel pointed out, is that depending on how a democracy is instituted, what can end up happening is that it can become very unwieldy in practice. So the United States is really 50 democracies that together work into one bigger democracy. And so not every country that falls into the category of democracy has this weird setup that we do. Ours goes back historically speaking. But a democracy can end up being very unwieldy, just like any other sort of system can. And so tied up with this, so unwieldy, and this is more likely to occur in a democracy than it is within a monarchy. Because in a monarchy, how many people are in charge of making the decisions? One. And that one person is only going to be able to interact with a small group of people at any given time. So if the king is in charge of making the decisions, then what ends up happening is the government can be relatively small because you have one person and just a small collection of their intimate advisors who most directly interact with them. In a democracy in which you have many people getting elected who are being voted by many people, it can get very messy and unwieldy. So you can end up having to have committees and other committees and et cetera, et cetera. So what are some of the other things tied in with a democracy? It's unwieldy. The inner workings are not guaranteed. So Sammy says the spread of news that is not true, and everyone is able to come up with stories. So let's talk about this. What do we need for a democracy to work? For a democracy to work well, you have many people with many different viewpoints. You have many people with one view, many others with others. For the democracy to function, what do all these people ultimately have to be able to do? You've got the Republicans on one side, the Democrats on the other. So you need to be accountable for your actions. But in this particular case, even before we get to the point of being accountable, what do you actually need for the government to be able to even make actions happen? In order for things to happen in a democracy, if half the people think one thing, a third think another, a third think this, and a tiny percent think this, what do they need to do before any actions? Yeah, there needs to be some sort of compromise and agreement reached. So for a democracy to function, for it to do things, it relies on compromise and agreement in a way that other forms of government do not. So for instance, if in a monarchy, say 99% of the population doesn't know what to do and they're frozen, can stuff still happen? If it's in a monarchy, say 99% of the population has no idea what to do, can stuff still get done? And why in a monarchy? Think about this. If the question is, what do you need for the monarchy to not grind to a halt? Well, who's making the decision? Yeah, the king needs to be the one making the decisions. So it doesn't matter if every single other person in the society is confused or can't agree, as long as one person makes up their mind. By contrast, what happens in a democracy if 50% of the people feel one way and 50% of the people feel another? What ends up happening? So say you've got something like a new infrastructure bill that needs to get passed, or you've got a say $1 trillion infrastructure bill that is designed to, add new highways. Well, if half the people vote yes and half the people vote no, what happens? As Daniel says, nothing happens. So the thing with a democracy is it requires compromise and agreement, or else it just grinds to a halt. By contrast, because a dictatorship or a monarchy is controlled by one person, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much disagreement there is, as long as one person knows what they're doing and what their plan is. So democracies can stop functioning without agreement and compromise. So can anyone think back to your US history classes. When was a time in the United States that our democracy stopped functioning because no compromise could be reached? And we had one side who strongly believed one thing and one side who strongly believed something else, and compromise became impossible. Can anyone think of a time in US history that happened? The Civil War, exactly, Justin. What was the issue in the Civil War that led to the government basically grinding to a halt? Come on. I know some of you are that, yes, slavery. The North wanted slavery abolished. The South did not want it abolished. They could not come to compromise. The government stopped functioning, and the only solution became a war. So that's one thing with democracy. You need a certain level of agreement for a democracy to function. Another issue with democracy that's worth highlighting, and again, the reason I'm talking about these issues here is that what I want to highlight is one of the things that has happened with modern technology is it has allowed the positives of democracy to become more positive and the negative to become more negative. And what I want to talk about is, given those considerations, how should we feel about democracy in the context of technology, and how should we feel about technology in the context of democracy? But before we get to that, I want to talk about just democracies in general. So what is another issue with democracies? So think about the US government and government institutions. Not all of them are complete democratic systems. So for instance, the president is elected, so that's democratic. The House of Representatives are elected, so that's fully democratic. The Justice Department is in some sense elected because we elect the executives who then choose the judges. But there are some branches within the United States institutions which are not at all democratically decided, except in the very loose sense of we choose someone who chooses someone who chooses someone. So one thing is corruption will, and we're going to come back to this more with when we're talking about the context, but yeah, things like Watergate or any sort of way in which political parties are operating against each other end up being a case in which democracies can fall flat, because you can have cases in which votes get manipulated or one side breaks the law to try to get one over on the other side. But more so than that, think about within the US government or within government organizations, or I guess branches of departments that fall under the US government where you still count as a government employee. Where are parts of this system in which decisions are not made democratically, but it is rather either one person or a very small group of people who were not elected directly making decisions? Can anyone think of anything where people who are technically speaking government employees are operating in a system? So CIA, what are some other ones that are related to CIA? So CIA is intelligence. In the CIA, it is not like the average person is voting. NSA, FBI. So yeah, any sort of defense. Federal Reserve, I don't want to get into the Federal Reserve issues, but that is definitely another one. The DEA, drug enforcement, yeah, the Drug Enforcement Administration, those sorts of things. But more generally speaking, so all of these are about defense. What else is about defense? It is even a clearer instance of a system that is not decided democratically. It is rather one person in charge who then tells two other people what to do. Yeah, the military. So why is it, let's just use the military because it's the clearest case, because it's like the CIA and DEA, a lot of this is classified, so the average person doesn't know exactly how it's organized. But a military organization, in a military, say you've got a war going on, who ultimately decides the game plan for how the war is going to be conducted? On the ground. So I mean, at the end of the day, the president is strictly in charge, but they aren't making decisions on the ground. They aren't deciding where certain troops should move. Who's in charge of that? Yeah, the commander, the general, the person at the top. Why is it that at the end of the day in a military unit, the decisions are made by one person? Why isn't it voted on? Why isn't it that all the soldiers get together and cast their votes on what the decisions are going to be? Yeah, that's the key. As Daniel says, quick action. The one major disadvantage of a democracy, another one, is it is very slow moving. A democracy is very slow because everyone needs to vote. When things have to happen quickly, it is much more efficient to have one person in charge. This is also why companies are generally, you have a single person. Now, they might be chosen by the board of governors or by the board of directors, but usually it's a CEO who makes the decisions. And the reason why is because one person can make decisions much more quickly than having a vote. Think about, in a military, you have matters of minutes to make important decisions. Should we move troops over here? Should we bomb this area? You have minutes before the people who you might bomb will have moved. So therefore, you need one person in charge. So the other flip side, by contrast, think about democracy. How long does it take for a law to get passed? Months, sometimes years. How long does it take for a vote, even an election? Think about a whole election cycle. For a presidential election, when do you start hearing about, so say the presidential election of 2024. When do you start hearing about the election for 2024? At the very least, 2022. And in some cases, you've already started to hear certain types of things about the election. Like there already are discussions about, will Trump run again? That's 4 years away, and the entire election cycle continues. By contrast, in a military thing, we're not talking about who the next commander is going to be 6 years out, 4 years out. And once we decide who the next commander is going to be, it's just a matter of signing some papers and putting them in charge. It can happen in a day. By contrast, let's just think about the practicality of the US election. When does the US presidential election cycle begin? So the 2020 election happened in November 2020. When did things start to be tied in with that? When did actual people start learning about the candidates? The candidates started debating with each other about who should become president. Yeah, so there were these debates. And before there was even the presidential debate, what were there? So before we even had it down to Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, what did we have to have? So there were rallies, and before these, so the way it worked is at the end, there were campaigns, but before we even had campaigns to become president. So it eventually became the case of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. And they were debating, they were rallying for the role of president. But before we even got here, exactly, they had to win the nomination of their parties. So before we even got to this point, or I guess the 2016 election would have been clearer because there were primaries and things like that on both sides. So before you could, so let's go back to the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. Before anything else could happen, we had to have contest between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and etc. And then on this side, we had to have Donald Trump. So it took over a year before we could even get to the point that we were ready for an election. That sort of thing takes forever in a democracy. Decisions take a very long time. In a dictatorship, how long do most coups last? Well, a good coup happens in a single night, because the way a coup works is the military takes over very quickly before the government that was previously in charge has time to respond. So it takes years for democracy to change. It takes a night for a dictatorship to change. So things happen slowly in a democracy. So anything that requires fast-pacedness, a democracy is not very good at handling. All right, is everyone on board with this? Can I get a test of who's actually alive and awake on the other end? If you're alive and awake and you're understanding things, can we get a yes or a thumbs up or something? For those of you who are dead, I'm sorry for your passing. All right, just making sure you're all here. Okay, you're all here. All right. So everyone on board with what democracies are, why we like them, and why there are some problems. Okay, what I now want to do is talk about the impacts of technology on democracy. And what I basically just want to do now is bring up a pros and cons list of what are the ways in which the development of modern technology has benefited democracy as a form of government, and what are the ways in which it has hurt it. So let's put the minuses over here, the pluses over here. And I'm going to open this up. So if nobody talks, we're just going to stand here for an hour and a half, and it's going to be real boring and uncomfortable. So I'm going to rely on you all to think for a minute. What are some of the benefits that modern technology, social media, computers, email, Facebook, what are some of the positives that it's had on the functioning of a democratic nation? A nation that's goal is to have the voting by the many, in which everyone is equal and everyone has the same say. What are the benefits that these technologies have had? And on the flip side, what are the negative consequences? What are some of the ways in which a society that is supposed to be equal for all and everyone gets a say and we compromise on issues to make progress? What are some of the ways in which democracy has been hurt by modern technology? So just think to yourselves, throw up either a good or a bad. Easier to reach out to more people. And do we say that's a good thing, Kevin? Is that a positive you're thinking of it as? Yeah, so a positive. Easier to reach audience. And voters. So why is this a good thing? Why is it easier to reach out? It allows people to get informed. It is easier to become informed on what people's views are. It's also much easier to promote your views. If you are a politician, you are much better able to provide people with information about you. You're also, as a voter, able to get that information better. So think about this. If, say, you wanted to know in the 2024 election more about Bernie Sanders' views, what could you do if you wanted to find out more about what Bernie Sanders stood for? Just go to Google. You have access to this information. If it was the year, say it's the year 1860, and the election was between Abraham Lincoln and somebody else, and you were trying to decide who to vote for, what would you have to do? You'd have to go and find a newspaper. So that's the first thing. And how many different viewpoints on this person could you get? If you wanted to get a very fair, even view, how many newspapers would you have to go and find? And more importantly, how long would that take? Yeah, you'd have to go and find a lot. Nowadays, if you want to hear all the positives of Bernie and all the negatives, how long is that going to take you? Yeah, a few minutes probably. You just have to Google a few clicks and you're there. So if you want to find out more, you can now look things up very, very quickly. So that is one thing. So also then, it's easier for these people to reach out to you. By contrast, if it's the year, say, 1860, and you don't like one of the things that Abraham Lincoln is suggesting, what can you do about it? What would the process be to reach out to Abe and tell him, hey, Abe, I don't like this idea? Or say you and like 100 friends all dislike this idea. What could you do about it in the year 1860? You could go to his rallies and talk to him, so you'd have to travel. And also, how would you, another question is, so yeah, you could petition, but what would that actually involve? Well, if it's the year 1860, you're writing letters, you're sending things, mail, it's going to take time. Nowadays, if you and 100, 1,000 like-minded individuals want to reach out to a government organization, or you want to point out that this organization is, this candidate is doing something that you don't agree with, what can you do about it? You can take to Twitter. What else can you do? Or let's say that you are somebody who disagrees with a certain point, but you're not sure whether there are others who feel similarly to you. And if there are, you want to connect with them. What can you do? You take to Facebook, you take to Twitter, you can go on the subreddits and see if there are other people who agree with you. And once you have enough people, you can create a group and you can start trying to campaign for or against this thing. So it is also much easier for grassroots organizations to arise. Do people know what's meant by grassroots? It's a term that is worth knowing. Anyone know what the phrase grassroots means? Okay, so grassroots organizing, you'll hear it in a lot of contexts of like local government, and it's just something to know. So the notion of grassroots is that it starts at the very bottom. So the roots of the grass are basically the very bottom of any sort of anything in like the physical world. So grassroots organizing is when you have a lot of people at the bottom who work together to get an issue heard. So for instance, Black Lives Matter in a lot of ways is a grassroots organization. What was BLM started by a president or a government organization or anything like that? No. How did the Black Lives Matter movement begin? So social media, but specifically who on social media? Who were the people who got involved in it? So people of color, but had you ever heard of any of them? Was it like Jay-Z getting out there and starting this? Was Jay-Z no, it was just average people who really cared about this issue and started mobilizing. So it started with like grassroots, it's large numbers of very small individuals who over time were able to organize. So thanks to social media, these types of organization and organizing is now popular, or is now very possible. So in some ways, why was it that we went in a very short period of time from the Black Lives Matter movement not existing to within a few years, every single business that wanted to keep making money had to tried to respect BLM. What was the reason behind it? Well, because lots of individuals were able to organize on social media, get their views heard, come together and had a platform to talk about what they were worried about, what they cared about, what injustices they saw, and make sure that everyone was able to hear it. There's another one. Why was it that the Me Too movement had a hashtag in the front? Yes, exactly, Rogelio. Why was it that hashtag Me Too? Have women only been being sexually harassed in the workplace in the past 10, 15 years? Is this suddenly something which came into existence? Is it like up until the year 2000, no sexual harassment, and then 2000 came around suddenly? No, of course not. So what changed? Why was it suddenly that Me Too was able to get off the ground and become a movement? Social media. So women who had been sexually harassed in the workplace before were generally speaking completely isolated from each other and had no way to reach out to a public audience. By contrast, as soon as one person was able to post it online, it then was able to snowball, and what was originally something that was happening in silence was now able to happen in public, and something was able to be done about it. So social media has allowed for these sorts of grassroots organizing and people to be heard like never before, and to make their voices heard, organize, and get social issues which had been ignored in the past out into the public, because now you are able to make your story and your concerns and the injustices known on social media. Also, police brutality is something that has happened for a very long time. What has changed? Why is it suddenly in the news much more than it was 50 years ago? What has changed with modern technology that is allowing a lot of instances of police brutality? Videos, that's the key. You can now take videos. Everyone is a documentary video recorder. So it is much easier to document injustice. So if you just hear through the grapevine that somebody has, like a certain person has been very violent, you can't do anything about it. But if you have a video of somebody beating somebody else, it completely changes it. As Rogelio says, it exposes the aggressor. So the nature of modern technology also allows people to document things like never before. So for instance, like if I say something like, child gets shot, you get an image of it, but it's not nearly as going to be nearly as disturbing as if I were to show you a picture of a child getting shot. That the latter is much more emotionally charged. So things, because of the nature of human beings and our tendency to be affected by emotionally charged things, the fact that injustices can now be documented allows for changes to be made like never before. So does all of this make sense to everybody? About how, and we want to say, like, if a democratic society is supposed to be equal, you shouldn't have certain groups of people being policed differently than others. And so by being able to document instances of that injustice so that people have to listen to it, you are able to make a more equal society. What are some other either positives or negatives of democracy in the context of modern technology? So let's talk about, so misinformation can be spread just as easily. Misinfo can spread. So this is the flip side of it's easier to reach out to your audience. Not only is it easier to reach out to an audience and tell them the truth, it is easier to reach out to an audience and tell them falsehoods. And so I want to save this one for a second because we're going to jump into this misinformation issue in a little more depth. But Justin, I'm going to be coming back to this, and this is going to probably get about a half an hour of attention. But before we jump in, I want to just cover some of the other short ones before we really dive in on the misinformation issue. I might actually save this one for last because I think it's something that we all really need to understand exactly how this works and why it's such a problem. Does anyone have any other positives or negatives other than misinformation and what the consequences of misinformation are going to be and why that's such a problem for democracy? We're going to save that one. But does anyone have any other positives or negatives that they want to throw up here? Well, think about the all right, Bernie Sanders ran for presidential or ran for Democratic nomination in both 2020 and 2016. Both times he came pretty damn close. What was it about Bernie Sanders's campaign that was so noteworthy? Well, think about most elections, most of the people who run for office. Who are they interacting with the most and where is their money coming from? So Kevin says the interactions, yeah, the Bernie campaign involved a lot of direct interaction with individual people. And that also carries over to the monetary aspect. So running in a campaign, an election, is it cheap? Is it easy to get to run a campaign? No. What do you need? You need a lot of money and sponsors. Why? What is that being used for? Why can't you just run a campaign with no money? What does the money allow you to do? Advertise. The number one, yeah, promote. You have to have travel budgets. You have to meet with people. So any campaign that wants to have any hope of succeeding needs money. You need to hold rallies. You need to, if you're Donald Trump, you need to get all those people into a large area so you can stand in front and wave your arms. So what is it about the Trump campaign and the Sanders campaign that are so noteworthy from a monetary perspective? Think about the year, imagine it's the year 1950. You might not know the answer to this, but say you need $15 million to campaign. What would be the easiest way to get $15 million in the year 1950? How many people would you go and ask? Yeah, you go to a lobbyist. You basically, who's likely to have $15 million sitting around? So say, yeah, either the very wealthy or also anyone, so also companies or anyone who is associated with those companies. Exactly, company owners. Because what would it actually take in the year 1950 for somebody to send you money? Think about this. If it's the year 1950 and you wanted to send a presidential candidate money, what would you have to do? You'd have to meet with them, or at the very least, you'd have to go and find a mailbox and the address and everything else. Nowadays, if you want to donate to a political campaign, what do? Venmo them, go to their website, wire it to them. Why does that matter? What is the difference here? Why does the fact that you can donate on Venmo or on a website, who does this allow to donate that had never been able to donate before? The common person. So this was the fundamental difference. If you look at elections earlier, almost all the donations were coming in these giant multi-million-dollar lumps. The Sanders campaign and the Trump campaigns were so noteworthy. They certainly had their lump sums, but for most of the money they got were coming in large numbers of $10 donations. That was something that was never possible before. So not only is it easier to find out about people, it is much easier for the common person to give money to politicians. So therefore, they're able to find politicians who more closely align with their views. So for instance, one of the reasons why we saw people who are much more, generally speaking, the political, what's the best way of putting this? The candidates who are getting close to getting the nominations, or in Trump's case, actually getting the nominations, are much less moderate than politicians were through much of American history. Most of American history, you did not have people with extreme views getting elected. And part of the reason why is because the nature of the system was such that money going into the campaigns ensured that the only people who were getting enough money were ones who weren't going to shake the vote too much. By contrast, now that anybody can donate $5 or $10, you can get just as much money reaching out to the common people and getting them on your side in large numbers. It used to be completely practical to get $15 million from one person and not at all practical to get $1 from 15 million people. But nowadays, thanks to the internet and online exchange of money, this has become possible, which means that the average person has more of a say in who their nominees are going to be from a financial perspective. Bernie Sanders coming close to getting the Democratic nomination twice is not something which could at all have happened before the internet came along. So that's another thing, is it's changed financing of campaigning. So what are some other things, either positive or negative, that we can talk about here? I think we can start moving to the negative side. Some of these are going to be things we've talked about all semester. What was the last point I just raised about democracy as one of the possible flaws in it? The thing that's different from the military. What is it about democracy that makes it different from the military? It's really slow. Why does that matter in this context? Why does the slowness of democracy matter? Or why does technology and the slowness of democracy interact? How does it interact? The technology evolves incredibly quickly. The laws do not. So what does that end up with? What is the consequence of having a democracy in a time of extremely fast technological development? And this is something we've basically been talking about all semester. What happens when you have a new piece of technology that has come about and the laws are too slow to keep up? It's hard to figure out what to allow. So for instance, data mining. We talked all in our data mining section about some of the things that data mining allows you to do. It allows you to cater someone's experience so that you have found out that they're pregnant before they know they're pregnant, and you give them things which they don't even realize you're giving them to try to manipulate you. They're trying to manipulate you into making a certain decision. Going back to that, how many of you felt okay with this? How many of you were concerned by the ways in which companies were able to data mine and find out you're pregnant based on what your purchases are and everything else? How many of you were uncomfortable with the idea that they were doing this, or trying to find out when you were drunk so that you'd be more likely to make unintelligent purchases? Justin was a bit uncomfortable. Who else was uncomfortable? Daniel was uncomfortable. Leslie was uncomfortable. Yeah, it was so all of you had, a lot of you were creeped out by this. However, are any of these things illegal? No, they weren't illegal. Why weren't they illegal? Well, because the technology had developed so quickly that the law couldn't keep up with it. So what you end up with is, one problem with a democracy is that you end up with very large legislative or very large legal vacuums. So you end up with a democracy with technology, you end up with these legal vacuums or policy vacuums, where you end up with technology that is unregulated in a way that can be damaging for a society as a whole. If a dictator didn't like data mining, what would the dictator do? Or to go another way, there are things which Google does that the Chinese government does not like. So how did China solve this problem? Does anyone know? Yeah, Google is banned in China. Google is inaccessible from Chinese servers. So if you as a authoritarian government dislike something that technology is doing, you can quickly and effectively put laws in place to stop it. So that is one issue with a democracy. Now, there are flaws to that sort of thing. What it can end up being exploited, so the government just ends up channeling what they want to have happen, as we talked about with things like the social credit system. But generally speaking, you have far fewer policy vacuums in an authoritarian government than you do in a democratic system. So part of the reason that big technology is getting so powerful and having to get called into Congress is because it has taken Congress and the law so long to catch up to these things. What are some other worries about having a democratic ideals in a time of high technology? What are some other ways in which the problems of democracy, the slowness, the need for compromise, what were the other things we talked about? The corruption. What are ways in which these sorts of things have been increased by modern technology? Do you guys want to jump into the misinformation one since we have it up here? Because this is going to take us a bit. We can just dive into this now, and then if it rattles out any other ideas, we can come back to them. All right, so let's do that. All right, I'm going to erase the board just so we have more information. So I'm trying to think of the best way of doing this. There's a few different issues along this line. Trying to think of what's the best way to start. Okay. We said that compromise is necessary for a democracy to function. If you get to a point in which people cannot agree, nothing happens. So what I want to talk about now is why compromise has been greatly affected by democratic or by the advent of modern technology. And I want to spell out all the different ways in which, like, you look around you in the world now, the United States is incredibly polarized. And do people know what this word polarized means? Yeah, divided. And so what polarized basically means is, think about the North Pole and the South Pole. That's the same pole of polarized. Here's the Earth. Where is the North Pole? Where does Santa Claus live? In the north, but how far north? Exactly, Justin. It's not just the top, it's the very top. It's the highest, toppest point. And where's the South Pole? The bottom, and the very, very bottom. So in the same way, it's the most southern point. From the South Pole, every other point is north. And from the North Pole, every other point is south. Anywhere you look from the North Pole, you're looking south. So the idea here is polarization is the tendency of groups to end up at incredibly extreme views. So polarized is divided, and not just divided between two groups which are similar, divided between two extremes. So instead of it being like, if you think about, imagine you have 100 people. And so this is, I'm going to draw a graph of number of people, and this is strength of views. So in an unpolarized view, so this could be political views, religious views, and this is a number of people who feel this way. So in a typical sort of non-polarized system, it might look something like this, where you've got a decent number of people, or even more likely, it's going to look something like this, where you have some people with extreme views, many more with moderate views, and then a few more at the other extreme. Does everyone understand what this little graph is showing? This is the strength. Here's very Republican, here's very Democratic, And this is the percentage of the population that has those views. This is a non-polarized system. Does that make sense to everyone what this little chart is showing? Just want to make sure that my graph is making sense. Now, what is a polarized system going to look like? It's going to look more like this. It's going to be a case in which the extreme views at the end, large numbers of people hold them, but in the middle, there are far fewer people. And why is a highly polarized system a problem for a democracy? What is the threat that it has? Well, think about it this way. If you and I are disagreeing about, say we're two members of the government, and we're disagreeing about, say, taxes, and we're disagreeing about how much, say, the wealthiest 1% of people, how high their tax rate should be in a given year. If you think that the appropriate number is 40, and I think the appropriate number is 50, how likely are we to find some compromise that we're both somewhat comfortable with so that we can actually get the tax plan pushed through? How likely does it seem? It seems pretty likely. What number might we fall on? They're not that far off. By contrast, imagine that I believe the correct percentage of tax is 2%, and you believe it's 80%. What's going to happen? Are we going to, 45 is still about in the middle, but are we ever going to get to 45? We're going to have to agree to disagree. But agree to disagree is not a solution in a government where we need to decide a tax rate. You and I can just agree to disagree. But if the two people in the government are, at the end of the day, taxes need to be paid. So if one side feels this way, the other side feels this way, 45%, it will leave both people slightly disappointed. But 45% is so far away from both 80 and from 2 that neither side is ever going to agree to it. So if you have a highly polarized society, things cannot get agreed upon and everything stagnates. And so what I want to talk about is how misinformation and other sorts of things have led to a great increasing of polarization in this country and in democracies in general. So why is it that this happens? How does it come about? Well, let's talk about how people get their information about a candidate or about the news. Let's go back to the year, say, 44 BCE. We're in Rome. For those of you who know your Roman history, basically, this is the year Caesar died. So if you are Caesar and you're a politician in ancient Rome, you want to start running for office. You want to get your platform out there. You want everyone to know your views. What would you have to do to get them to know it? Anyone know? How would you share these views with people? It was a time of most people were illiterate. Modern technology had not been invented. How, if you wanted to run for politics, what would you have to do to get people to? You'd go to a large space, bring them together, and you would speak to them. So it was actually, they wouldn't do it in the Colosseum, they do it in what was the Roman Forum, which was basically the town square of Rome. You would get up on this big rock or this big platform, and you would gather the people, and you would just talk to them. You would just speak out. You might have a debate with somebody else and disagree in public, but you would go to a public space and talk to these people about your own views. They could ask you questions, they could interact. So who got to listen to you speak? Who heard what you were saying? And I mean that, like, not asking for particular individuals. I just mean if you were to describe, whoever showed up. And so whoever showed up to this public place got to hear. And who decided and who got to show up in this public place? Anybody who wanted to come and listen to you. So Some people would agree with you, some people wouldn't, but they were all hearing you and they were all hearing you say the same thing. So they could all, on the basis of the same information, decide what they felt about you. They all were presented with it in the same place, same time, same issues. Now, it's the year 2022. You are, or I guess right now, you decide you want to run for the House of Representatives. You want to be the next AOC. You want to be a nobody who decides to run for your local House of Representative and become a member of the United States House of Representatives. You want your platform out there and you want people to know about you. What do you do? How do you go about sharing this information? You go to social media. So what are we talking here? Let's just put the company names up here. What would you, where would you advertise in particular? Insta, YouTube. Where else? I'm sure some of you are procrastinating looking at these things right now. So what are we looking at? Twitter. So CNN, you'd eventually want to get your news stories on CNN, but you can't actually advertise on CNN as a politician because it's a news organization. Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, what else? If you're running in the year 2026, you're going to be doing it on TikTok for sure. If you want the boomers in, where are you going? Where do the boomers think? Well, yeah, you could go on radio, but the semi-tech savvy boomers are still going on Facebook. So these are the sorts of things. Newspapers as well for like the super old boomers. But for the ones who are semi-tech savvy, they're all using Facebook. So these are the places you go to. Now, what is the fundamental difference between a person standing on a rock in a public space and a person who is sharing information on these sorts of platforms? What is the fundamental difference between this rock and these platforms? So one is you can reach more people, but that's a matter of scale, not a matter of difference in kind. So by difference in kind, I mean that things are like an apple and an orange are different kinds of things. An apple and a much larger apple, different size, but they're not fundamentally different kinds of things. So in this case, there is a difference in degree or a difference in size where you reach a lot more people this way, but that's not the only way. And social media can be manipulated, but in a certain sense, so could this. You could get up here and start spouting lies. So you could lie just as well here as here. What is the fundamental difference between a rock in a public park and these systems? Physical versus digital, that is one major difference. There are different types of media. One of them is physical, one of them is digital. People can interact, but you could also interact here. So I think physical versus digital is related to it, but tied in with this being physical, and let's just call these spaces, they're digital spaces. But at the end of the day, I want you all to keep guessing until we touch on the key fundamental difference here that is going to be of importance right now. It's not size, it's not type of media. What is the fundamental difference between Instagram and a rock? Other than the physical digital, and specifically a rock in a public space. More persuasive is part of it. All right, I'll ask the leading question. Who owns this rock? It's in a public space. Who owns it? No one owns it, or at the very least, the Roman government owns it. Who owns Instagram? Facebook does. And who owns Facebook? Is it owned by a government public organization? Investors, owners, these are private. This is public. Our discourse around politics used to be carried on in public spaces. Our discourse on politics are now carried out on privately owned digital spaces that are accessible to everybody, but are still in the hands of private companies. A way of thinking of this is our town square has no longer remained in a public space. It is now a private space. Now, why does this matter? On one hand, you might just think it's a difference in degree or a difference in amount of information shared or difference in ease with which you reach people. And that's how Instagram, Twitter, TikTok present themselves. These are things that are provided by private companies, but they are fully public. But think for a second, what is the difference here? If you go into the square and you are listening to someone speaking, so say this is you and this is me, and we go into a public space to hear a politician speak, compare what you're hearing to what I'm hearing. Your ears hear something, my ear hears something. What do we hear in comparison to each other? We're standing next to each other at a speech. The same thing, exactly. If this politician says, Carthage must be destroyed, I hear it, you hear it. Same thing. If this politician says we are going to tax the rich, you hear it, I hear it. Now contrast this with Instagram. You have Instagram, I have Instagram. We turn on our phones at the exact same time. What comes up on our Instagrams? Here's your phone, here's my phone. Describe what's going to come up. So specifically though, personalized content, but what is just at the base level, if you were explaining to your old grandma what comes up when you turn on Instagram, what would you say appears? Pictures. A picture comes up, maybe two pictures. And what's going to show up on mine? Two pictures. What are these pictures going to be of? Is this picture on yours going to be the same as the picture on mine? No, this is going to be catered to you, and this is going to be catered to me. They are going to be different. And specifically, how are they going to be different? What is going to determine what shows up on each of ours? Who decides what the first photo to show up every time you turn on Instagram is? The algorithm. And so there's an algorithm that is running in the background that decides what to show you. And again, an algorithm is just a very long math equation that spits out an. So basically, there's an AI algorithm that is deciding what you should see at that moment. And what sorts of factors go into what this algorithm decides to show you? What is this algorithm? So two questions. One, what is this algorithm trying to decide to show you first? And two, how does it make that decision? And I'm not asking for like the details, stuff that is engaging for you. So what photo does it want to show you first? If it were to give a description of what the algorithm is trying to find, what is it trying to find? Well, it's trying to find the #1 most engaging photo for you. And what do we mean by engaging here? What does engaging mean practically in this case? The one that holds your interest, the one that makes you swipe the longest, or be most likely to swipe the most times afterwards, to keep scrolling. Instagram shows you the photo that it has calculated is going to be the one that leads to you being on Instagram for the longest amount of time. Why does it do this? What does Instagram get out of you being on Instagram? Why does it want to hold your interest? Ads, exactly. The longer, every second that you are on Instagram is a second that you can see an advertisement on Instagram. So if you are on Instagram for 1 second, that's only 1 second that an advertiser can sell you something. If you're on Instagram for 15 minutes, that's 15 minutes during which time you can see an advertisement. If you're on Instagram for 4 hours, that's 4 hours during which Instagram can show you an advertisement. So the longer you're on Instagram, the better it is for Instagram, because then they can say we have 18 hours of engagement. And that amount of engagement means more ads time, which means companies will pay more money to advertise on Instagram. So Instagram's goal is to get you to stay on their page for as long as possible, because that's going to make them the most money. Everyone understand just the practicalness of these algorithms deciding what you see. Now, what are the practical implications of this in this more general context? Well, how does the algorithm decide? What goes into its decisions of what things you are going to look at? How does it go about deciding what things will hold your interest for the longest? This is the question. What things get decided? If the algorithm decides to start showing you lots of pictures of dogs, why did it decide to start showing you lots of pictures of dogs? You probably looked for dogs. It knows you're a dog person. Exactly. It has identified your interests. And how has it done that? How has it decided that it knows you're a dog person? Data mining from earlier in the semester. Yeah, it data mines your past behaviors, combines it with the other information it has. So because Instagram and Facebook are related, if you have both an Instagram and a Facebook owned by the same company, any likes you have on Facebook or any people you follow on Instagram, if you follow 26 dog accounts and only one other account total, then it probably knows you're a dog person and you will look at more dog photos. So this is just the data mining stuff from earlier in the semester. But why does this matter in the context of democracy? Why does this matter in the context of what we're talking about today? Well, can anyone think what implications is this going to have for democracy and a functioning democratic society? Can anyone connect the dots and see where we're going with this? Right now, I'm seeing lots of dog pictures because I like dogs. You're seeing a lot of cat pictures because you like cats. And me. And Instagram knows this from our past behaviors. But are the only things on Instagram dog pictures and cat pictures and cute shirts? Are those the only things that appear on Instagram? No. What other sorts of things appear on Instagram or on Facebook? What other sorts of information gets transmitted on these things? Memes, that's another one. Opinions and political stuff as well, though. So it's not just that you can look at the memes and the cute things. You can also follow politicians. And not only that, you can get people's opinions on news stories or links to news stories. So you begin to get you don't just get customized purchasing experiences, you start getting customized political information. And so, politics. You and I are getting politics, but specifically, what politics are we getting? Or if I love one politician and you love a different, so say I love Donald Trump, I just love him to death, and you love Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Who is going to show up on your Instagram feed? What politicians and their Instagram feed and their photos or their campaign messages are you going to see? So if let's say you're the AOC fan, what are you gonna see? You're gonna see AOC, you're gonna see what other sorts of things? What sorts of news stories are you gonna get? Yeah, you might get Bernie. Are you gonna get news stories about the importance of owning a gun? No, you're not. I love @RealDonaldTrump and imagine I followed his Instagram religiously. Yeah, you're gonna get universal health care as well if you're AOC. Messages about that, or a video of somebody explaining how universal health care would help them, or not the problems they've had not having health care. By contrast, if I follow Trump, what sorts of news articles or videos am I gonna get? Somebody said it before, QAnon stuff is quite possible. What other sorts of things? So what sorts of, yeah, I'm gonna get things about walls, or the importance of walls, or about the damage caused by illegal immigration. What other sorts of things might I get? Stuff about guns, stuff about the damage that could be caused by North Korea. So you can start to see how it's not just that you are getting dogs and I'm getting cats, but also we are getting very different information about what's happening in the world right now. Even though all this information is out there for all of us, the Facebook algorithm is giving me things which align with my interests. And why? Why is it giving me, the Donald Trump fan, stuff about guns, and you, the AOC fan, stuff about universal health care? Why does that benefit Facebook/Instagram? Or I guess we call them Meta now. What do they get out of this? Why is it that you want to show me the gun stuff and you the universal healthcare stuff? Yeah, exactly. More time on the app. Here's the fact. People, generally speaking, like to spend time with people who they agree with on stuff. So for instance, if you have views about, so say you believe that every woman should have the right to an abortion, and then you have two people you can choose to sit next to at lunch. Somebody who believes that women should have the right to abortion and somebody who believes abortion should be illegal. If that's all you know about them, who are you going to sit next to at lunch? And I don't mean this is a trick question. Just who would you choose to, if you had views on one side of this issue, who would you choose to sit with? Again, here's the case. You walk into a cafeteria. You see two people, you don't know either of them well, but you're just sitting in a talk on abortion. One of them has the same views as you. The other one has different views of you. Who do you sit with? Whoever shares the same opinion, just because or alone. Okay, you could sit alone. That is a choice, but you're certainly, almost certainly not going to sit with the person who has the opposite views of you. So you will engage more with things that support the views already. No worries, Justin. You're going to sit with a person who shares views with you, because generally speaking, we like being around people who have similar views to ourselves. So what this ends up doing is people end up only getting information that aligns with the things that are already supporting the things that they believe. So in a certain sense, this is a very general sort of case, but we can talk about a more practical one of a case in which the exact same news story or the exact same event ends up being presented completely differently to different people based on what their previous political views are. So imagine there's a case in which here's a US airplane. This airplane flies over an ISIS stronghold area and drops a bomb. In this bomb, 80 civilians are killed and 10 ISIS leaders are killed. Now, This is the exact same event. It's the exact same thing. Bomb gets dropped. 80 civilians, 10 ISIS fighters die. Now, if you were reading this online, generally speaking, there's only going to be a certain amount of information that can be contained in the headline. And different people with different priorities and different views are going to put this headline differently. One is likely to say, USA bombs 80 civilians. The other one will say, US successfully eliminates 10 ISIS leaders. These are headlines on online news stories that are about the same exact event. Now imagine that based on your Facebook likes, your Instagram policies, Facebook identifies that you are somebody who believes strongly in the importance of destroying terrorism, no matter the costs, and believes that America is doing good in the world and helping to make the world a safer place. Which of these two headlines are you going to get? US successfully eliminates 10 ISIS leaders, or USA bombs 80 civilians? If your preferences have indicated to Facebook that you believe in the importance of eliminating terrorism wherever, yeah, you are going to get a news story that says USA eliminated 10 ISIS leaders. And after you read this headline, how are you going to feel about the US? You felt pretty good about it overall because of it fighting terrorism. How are you going to feel after you read this headline? Better, worse, the same? You're going to be proud. You're going to feel good. Your patriotic feelings are going to go up. Now imagine Facebook identifies that you are somebody who believes one of the greatest concerns in America today is Islamophobia, and that the US military has far too much power, and that American imperialism is a huge issue. Which of these two versions of the story are you going to get? "80 civilians. And how are you going to feel after you read this headline? How are you going to feel about America? You're going to be disappointed. So over here, your patriotism has gone up, or my patriotism has gone up. Your patriotism has gone down from the exact same event. And what determined whether our patriotism went up or down? What caused this difference? Why is it that I've gone down and you've gone up? The delivery of the news, and specifically, who is the one who caused this to take place? If we were to point the causal part of it, what actually led to my patriotism going down and yours going up? Well, what determined which news story we got? The algorithm. So we've now got an algorithm that is not just trying to give you advertisements for shoes you like. It is now giving you different versions of the world from what it gives me. So this is why this private versus public thing really, really matters. Because in a public space, everyone has access to the same information. And in theory, the internet, everyone can go on the exact same websites if they put in the time and effort. So in a certain sense, if we go to the ultimate point of everyone working hard to find out the truth, the internet is going to be better for an internet age is going to be better than a non-internet age. However, most of us do not take the time to read everything. Rather, most of us go to those websites that are ones that we already know are somewhat aligned with our views. Or we go to Facebook wanting to get the general news, but Facebook or Instagram or TikTok have already provided us with a catered view of what the world is like, one that is already in line with the tendencies we have. So what is the effect of this? what does this end up causing? Well, how is this going to lead to polarization? Why is it that the rise of the internet has led to this polarization? So think about this. I live over here, and say I'm well, we'll put on the right. I am very right, or I have some right-wing tendencies, and Facebook's algorithm picks up on it. And you have left-wing tendencies. Facebook's algorithm picks up on that. It's the year, say, 2010. I have somewhat left-wing, you have somewhat right-wing, and we start getting news stories. So I'm going to get more about the importance of universal health care, the way in which the military is spending too much money. You're going to get news stories about victories in the Iraq War and their importance for democracy there. You're going to get things about the importance of individual rights and freedoms. What's going to happen over time as we get more and more and more of these stories? If you started off left wing and you're getting stories about universal health care, AOC, Bernie, and all of these things, over time, what is going to happen to your views? Are they going to get, they're going to change. And in what direction? Are they going to get weaker or are they going to get stronger? Your left wing views. They're going to get stronger. Exactly. So if you are being presented only with information that is in line with what you get, over time, your views are going to move to the left. By contrast, if I'm getting stuff that is liked by @RealDonaldTrump and all, or I'm getting views that are about the importance of the American military, how are my views going to change? How am I going to feel about, if let's say I liked the military somewhat, and then 10 years I get pro-military news stories, how am I going to feel 10 years later about the military compared to 10 years before? I liked them pretty well before. Now, how am I going to feel? I'm going to be more right-wing and I'm going to love the military even more than I did. So over time, I'm going to become more far to the right. And all of this is happening without my intending any change. It's rather that my Facebook is being catered to me through these algorithms in a way based on what Facebook's goals are trying to get me to stay on the website longer, and in so doing, getting my views to become more extreme than they were 10 years before. Does everyone see how this process works? Basically, you are being presented with the news that Facebook decides you will be most likely to like. And that means that you are going to get the version of the story that supports your pre-existing beliefs, not any version that goes against it. And so what does this prevent from happening? We said what became impossible before the Civil War? Why did the Civil War break out? What couldn't the two sides do? They couldn't communicate and they couldn't agree. And so what we're seeing is through these algorithms and things like this, what ends up happening is we have bubbles of people that literally are living in hearing different versions of the world. And because of that, they have views that are becoming so different that no agreement or communication is becoming possible. Because the people over here hear a version that is so different from the people over here that they can't even imagine what's going on in the other side's head. So everyone understand how this is possible. Like, what is happening here with these bubbles of information? And so this is how polarization comes about. Now what I want to do with this is move on to the next point of it, which is this very quickly turns into fake news and misinformation and manipulation. So thus far, we've been talking about cases in which sides can't end up being polarized simply because they are getting given different versions of the same story. But So what do we mean by fake news here? What is fake news? I want to give kind of a technical definition of it. When someone says that there's something is fake, a fake news story, what is it they mean? It's something that seems real but's not. And here's the key though, is most of the things we talk about as fake news, like the stories that there were, or let's say the vaccine will make you magnetic. Did the person who wrote this story think it was true? Did the person who wrote this and posted it online actually think the vaccine was going to make you? So the person who originally wrote the story, not the person who retweeted it or followed it, did this person who wrote it actually believe that the vaccine was going to make them magnetic? Does anyone? Yeah, maybe. But in many cases, so here's the key idea with fake news. When the real problematic fake news, and how I'm going to be using this, are when the stories are written by someone who knows they're false. So very often, these misinformation stories will be written like the person, in this particular case, the person who wrote that the vaccines are going to make you magnetic knew that they would not, but they wanted other people to believe the false thing. It was designed to be manipulative and to get people to change their views. And in many cases of like truly problematic fake news, I'm just going to be defining it as fake news is news that is designed knowing full well that what it's saying is false, but the goal is to manipulate people. So there were a lot of instances of fake news during the 2016 and 2020 election, both by people within the US, but also a lot of fake news stories were being written in Russia. Yeah. So there was an entire branch within the Russian, like there was this department within, I think, the Russian Department of Defense, where they just hired a bunch of coders to create a bunch of fake news articles and then post them on Facebook and make these Facebook bots to create groups that could then manipulate people into thinking that a lot of people believe this information. So things like Hillary Clinton was running a child pedophilia ring out of a pizza parlor. That was written by someone who knew it was false, but people took it up and started believing it. So when you hear these things from the outside, when you hear that there are people out there that believe the vaccine is going to make you magnetic, and what is your first impulse when you hear that this is a story that people are believing? So your first impulse should be to check the source. But even before that, what is your gut feeling? If you hear that 1 million Americans believe that the vaccines are going to make you magnetic so you'll stick to the walls and won't be able to get up, what is the first thought that's going to go through your head? So maybe it's true. So that is one thing, is you might wonder whether it's true, or you might have the opposite view of whoever believes that has to be dumb. But how is it that these fake news stories are able to spread? Why is it that they are being so there's the vaccines contain a microchip that feeds off the 5G antennas to turn us into government androids. So why is it that people believe these things? Or how is it that it spreads? Well, one issue is people want them to spread, so it creates more division. But no one checks the sources they just share. And specifically, though, who do these stories get presented to? Who gets presented with fake news? If you are somebody who 100% believes that the vaccine is the best way to stop COVID and is crucial, and there should be a vaccine mandate, would you ever be shown a news story that says there's microchips that are going to turn us into government slaves? No, you would never see that story. So who will see that story? Someone who's either gullible or someone who they've identified as somebody who is likely to believe it if it's presented to them, or at the very least, likely to click on it. So that's So fake news spreads by the exact same mechanism, where what ends up happening is you get presented, fake news only goes to people who are inclined to believe the things the fake news says. So for instance, I would never get a fake news story that says that the vaccines are going to cause me to turn magnetic, or that the vaccines are going to fill me with microchips. But I might click on a fake news story that says something like, Trump tried to deport Lin-Manuel Miranda. That's a fake news story that, even though it's just as fake as any of the others, I would be more inclined to click on than one about vaccines, because it knows that my interests lend this way. Yeah, so there is fake news that caters to Democrats to push them farther one way and disagree with the Republicans and hate Trump more. There's fake news that's catered to Republicans to get them to hate Democrats. There's fake news that's catered to people within the Black Lives Matter movement to make them feel even more dislike of certain police organizations. There's fake news put into police organizations to make them hate Black Lives Matter movement protesters even more. So the goal of the fake news is to control public opinion by presenting fake things to people that are going to get liked and passed on, and be passed on to people who are most likely to believe those things. And so what this means is, one thing that technology is allowed for is propaganda on a scale that it's never. And do people know what's meant by propaganda? I can't remember if that's an A. Ganda. Can't remember if that's an A or an O, but you get the idea. What is propaganda? So it's basically, it doesn't even have to be news. Propaganda is basically any information that is being given to somebody for the express purpose of changing their views or getting them to believe a certain thing. So like the famous Uncle Sam pointing at, like, the poster of Uncle Sam pointing and saying, I need you for the army. That right there is a propaganda poster designed to make you more likely to join the army. So propaganda is anything that is presented to someone in a way that is inclined to change their views. And so one thing that's happened is propaganda has greatly moved on to Facebook in the form of fake news or fake Twitter accounts. So for instance, during one thing that the Russian organization did was create a lot of fake accounts and infiltrate different groups of people. And so it infiltrated like a Black Lives Matter group and put out incredibly extremist views about things like shooting police officers. And this was not actually endorsed by anyone, but their goal was to make Black Lives Matter look completely unrealistic and completely irresponsible and over the top and extreme. They then went on the flip side and did the same exact thing in Facebook groups that supported police officers and had things being said like, we need to shoot all the Black people. And then what ends up happening is both groups then look at the other group and think they're much more extreme than they were, because in essence, what the Russian organization was able to do was convince the opposite sides of something that the other side was even more extreme than they actually were, thereby increasing distaste and disagreement. So does everyone understand then how this works and why the fact that this stuff has moved on to a privatized network that is governed by money and governed by ad revenue is leading to these problems within democracy? Are people following along still? We're going to be finishing up in just a few minutes, so gather the last of your energy and we'll push through. Does anyone have any questions about this? About either the process by which it happens, why it happens, why it's been allowed to happen, any of those practical sorts of points. All right, so just to summarize, we've basically spent all class just talking about the good things of democracy and the ways some of those good things have been made better by technology. We've now taken these bad things and talked about how some of these bad things have been made worse by technology. And so to end, I just want to ask a question, which is, has technology done more good or more bad for democracy? Just think about it for a minute. Has the ways in which, Kevin says more good for sure. I'm not as sure that it's more good, just because of the way in which like our system is literally breaking down. I think it's like, in some ways, it has definitely allowed certain marginalized groups. Yeah, it's a very difficult question. Yeah, and so it was definitely, I agree with Daniel, it was doing very good until people discovered you could manipulate it. And so one of the paper prompts, which I'm going to be posting this weekend, I forgot to do it this week, but I don't think anyone was working on their paper this week anyway. One of them is going to be about this. So just, has it done more good or bad? So if this is a topic that interests you, it is something you can write your second paper on. Are there any more questions, comments, concerns, feelings, anything? I know I've lost some of you because you've been silent all class and it's the week before Thanksgiving and this has been a long, long semester. Out of curiosity, how many, actually, I'm gonna stop the recording and then I'm gonna ask this question because it doesn't need to be recorded.